The most cruel diseases transmitted by incestuous lineages, hidden tragedies in rural Alabama. In the dense forests of northern Alabama, where mist clings to the valleys like secrets to a family name, there exists a place known to locals as Pine Hollow. This isolated pocket of civilization remained largely untouched by the progress that swept across America in the post-war era of the 1950s. Here, nestled between rocky outcrops and hidden from main thoroughfares, generations of the Blackwood family established roots as deep and tangled as the ancient oaks that surrounded their homesteads. The year was 1957 when Dr. Thomas Harrison, a young physician newly assigned to the county health department, first encountered the Blackwoods. Fresh from medical school with idealistic notions of rural healthcare, Dr. Harrison had volunteered for assignment in Walker County, eager to bring modern medicine to underserved communities. His first visit to Pine Hollow came after reports of children with unusual medical conditions reached the department. The Blackwoods keep to themselves, warned Nurse Margaret Fletcher, a local who had reluctantly agreed to guide him. Been that way for generations. The whole hollow is practically one family, if you understand my meaning, Doctor. Harrison did understand, though his medical training had only briefly touched on the genetic implications of consanguinity marriages between blood relatives. What he witnessed in Pine Hollow would become the focus of his life's work and eventually shed light on one of rural America's most hidden health crises. The rutted dirt road ended at a cluster of small wooden houses, some little more than cabins, arranged in a loose circle. Children played in the yards while adults eyed the health department vehicle with suspicion. Harrison immediately noticed something unusual. Several children exhibited similar physical characteristics: unusually shaped skulls, malformed limbs, and distinctive facial features. Samuel Blackwood, the family patriarch, greeted them at the central house. A stern man in his 60s with calloused hands and penetrating blue eyes, he reluctantly allowed the doctor inside after Nurse Fletcher's careful introduction. "We take care of our own, doctor," Samuel stated firmly. "Always have. Don't need outsiders poking and prodding." "I'm here to help, Mr. Blackwood," Harrison replied. "The county sent me because there were concerns about some health issues among the children." Samuel's weathered face remained impassive. "Our ways go back generations. My grandfather settled this hollow after the Civil War. His children married their cousins because that's all there was. We've continued because it keeps the land in the family, keeps our ways pure." As Harrison conducted basic examinations of the children, he documented concerning patterns: 3 children with polydactyly, extra fingers and toes, 2 adolescents with severe intellectual disabilities, and several younger children with distinctive facial anomalies suggesting potential developmental disorders. Most troubling was 4-year-old Eliza, who exhibited signs of a progressive neurological condition that Harrison couldn't immediately identify. "She started having tremors at 2, explained Mary Blackwood, Eliza's mother and Samuel's granddaughter. "Now she can barely walk, and the seizures come almost daily." The worry in Mary's eyes betrayed the stoic facade maintained by most family members. What Harrison couldn't know then was that Eliza suffered from a rare recessive genetic disorder, Blackwood disease, as it would later be documented in medical literature. The condition, characterized by progressive neurological degeneration, would claim her life before her 8th birthday, as it had claimed others in the family before her. The patterns Harrison observed that day were the visible manifestations of generations of inbreeding. The Blackwood family tree, which he would painstakingly document over the coming years, revealed multiple instances of first-cousin marriages, and in 2 cases, unions between uncle and niece. The isolated geography of Pine Hollow, combined with strong social taboos against marrying outsiders, had created a genetic island where recessive disorders flourished with devastating consequences. As Harrison prepared to leave that first day, Samuel Blackwood fixed him with an intense stare. "Doctor, we know our children aren't always right, but they're ours, and we love them. Whatever you think of our ways, remember that." That evening, back in his modest office in Jasper, Harrison began what would become an extensive case file on the Blackwood family. His medical training told him that the conditions he observed were likely the result of recessive genetic mutations being expressed when identical defective genes were inherited from both parents, a situation far more common in consanguineous relationships. Yet his education hadn't prepared him for the human reality of these genetic consequences. Over the next months, Harrison would document 17 distinct hereditary conditions among the extended Blackwood clan, ranging from relatively minor physical anomalies to devastating progressive disorders. The family's isolation meant these conditions had gone largely undiagnosed and untreated. with folk remedies and resignations serving as the primary responses to suffering. But the Blackwoods were far from unique in rural Alabama. As Harrison expanded his research, he discovered similar patterns in other isolated communities across the state's mountainous regions and impoverished rural areas. The combination of geographical isolation, poverty, limited education, and strong cultural traditions had created numerous genetic islands where consanguinity was common practice, with similarly devastating health consequences. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. The shocking revelations of these hidden genetic tragedies will change your understanding of rural America forever. The spring of 1958 brought both renewal to the Alabama countryside and deeper insight into the Blackwood family's genetic tragedy. Dr. Thomas Harrison had spent the winter months researching hereditary disorders and consulting with genetic specialists at the University of Alabama Medical Center, which had recently expanded under the Hilburton Axe Hospital construction program. What you're describing fits patterns we're seeing in several isolated communities, confirmed Dr. Eleanor Wright, one of the few female geneticists in the South at that time. The Walker County cases appear particularly severe due to the multi-generational nature of the consanguinity. Armed with new knowledge and diagnostic techniques, Harrison returned to Pine Hollow with a more systematic approach. The Blackwoods, initially resistant, had grown more cooperative after Harrison arranged medical treatment for several family members, including anti-seizure medications for young Eliza. On this visit, Harrison brought a photographer to document physical symptoms and a laboratory technician to collect blood samples. The medical team meticulously recorded physical measurements, symptoms, and family relationships, slowly building a comprehensive genetic portrait of the isolated community. The most striking case was that of the Jensen brothers, Richard and Michael, cousins to the Blackwoods through maternal lines. Both boys, aged 9 and 7, exhibited a distinctive form of progressive blindness that began with night blindness and gradually advanced to total loss of vision. Their mother, Ellen Jensen née Blackwood, had married her second cousin, James Jensen, combining two branches of an already intertwined family tree. It started with Richard when he was about 5, Ellen explained as she sat on the porch of their small farmhouse. He kept bumping into things at dusk. We thought he was being careless until Michael started showing the same problems. Harrison recognized the symptoms as consistent with retinitis pigmentosa, a hereditary degeneration of the retina. In his notes he wrote, "The Jensen case represents a classic example of autosomal recessive inheritance. Both parents appear asymptomatic carriers, but their consanguineous relationships significantly increase the risk of their children receiving 2 copies of the defective gene." What made the Pine Hollow situation particularly tragic was the clustering of multiple rare conditions within a single extended family. Beyond the neurological disorder affecting Eliza and the retinal degeneration in the Jensen brothers, Harrison documented cases of congenital heart defects, skeletal malformations, metabolic disorders, and intellectual disabilities, all occurring at rates far above those in the general population. Samuel Blackwood, despite his initial resistance to Harrison's investigation, gradually became a valuable ally. The family patriarch's sharp memory provided crucial historical information about previous generations. "My grandfather's first family almost all died young," Samuel recounted during a lengthy interview. "He blamed it on the war and hard times, but they had the shaking sickness like little Eliza. His second wife was from outside the hollow, and those children, including my father, lived longer. But when the marriages turned back inward, the sicknesses returned. This pattern of genetic refreshing followed by reversion to consanguinity was common in isolated communities. Outside marriages temporarily introduced genetic diversity, reducing the expression of recessive disorders. However, strong cultural preferences for keeping property and traditions within the family typically led subsequent generations back to consanguineous unions." Harrison's research extended beyond Pine Hollow to other isolated communities in northern Alabama. In the mining town of Colville, he documented a cluster of families with hereditary hemolytic anemia. In the farming settlement of Red Hill, he found multiple cases of a distinctive form of dwarfism. Each community had its own genetic signature, a unique set of disorders, reflecting its particular founding population and subsequent inbreeding patterns. By late 1958, Harrison had compiled enough data to publish his initial findings in the Southern Medical Journal. His paper, Hereditary Disorders in Isolated Rural Populations of Northern Alabama, documented 27 distinct genetic conditions across 5 communities, with consanguinity rates ranging from 32% to 67% of marriages. The medical establishment's reaction was mixed. Some colleagues dismissed Harrison's concerns as overstated, arguing that consanguinity was declining naturally with increasing mobility and education. Others recognized the public health implications but questioned whether intervention was appropriate given the deeply rooted cultural practices involved. Dr. Wright from the University Medical Center became Harrison's strongest ally. Together, they secured a small research grant to expand the study and develop educational materials for rural healthcare providers. What we're seeing in Alabama isn't unique, Wright noted during a presentation to county health officials. Similar patterns exist throughout Appalachia and other isolated rural regions. The difference is that Dr. Harrison has documented these cases systematically rather than treating them as isolated medical curiosities. The human impact of these genetic disorders extended beyond physical symptoms. Many affected families faced social stigma, economic hardship, and limited educational opportunities. The Jensen family, for instance, had withdrawn their boys from the local school after relentless teasing about their vision impairment. The other children call them bat boys because they can't see in the dim light, Ellen Jensen confided to Harrison. The teacher didn't know how to help them, and the school had no resources for children with special needs. This social dimension of genetic disorders became increasingly central to Harrison's work. Medical intervention could address some symptoms, but the broader challenges required community education and social support systems that barely existed in rural Alabama in the 1950s. Meanwhile, medical science was advancing rapidly. The structure of DNA had been discovered just a few years earlier. In 1953, opening new frontiers in understanding genetic inheritance. While these breakthroughs had yet to translate into practical diagnostic tools for rural physicians, they provided a theoretical framework for understanding the patterns Harrison observed. In his journal, Harrison wrote, "The tragedy of these communities is that much suffering could be prevented with basic genetic counseling and education, yet the very isolation that has created these genetic patterns also keeps these families from accessing modern medical knowledge." As 1958 drew to a close, Harrison's work had documented the medical consequences of consanguinity more thoroughly than any previous study in the American South. Yet he increasingly recognized that addressing the issue required more than medical intervention. It demanded sensitive engagement with deeply held cultural practices and beliefs. The Blackwood family's story had become a window into a hidden aspect of rural American life, one rarely discussed in medical literature or acknowledged in public health planning. The patterns of disease that had emerged from Harrison's research would eventually contribute to broader understanding of genetic inheritance and inform more culturally sensitive approaches to public health in isolated communities. Summer heat hung heavy over Pine Hollow in July 1959, matching the weight of the decisions facing the extended Blackwood family. 2 years into Dr. Harrison's study, the community had begun to grapple with the implications of his findings. Young Eliza's condition had deteriorated rapidly despite medical intervention, bringing the reality of Blackwood disease into sharp focus for the entire family. "She doesn't recognize me anymore," Mary Blackwood confessed to Dr. Harrison during his monthly visit, her voice breaking. "Her eyes look right through me like I'm not even there." The neurological disorder that would later be formally classified as familial cerebral amyloid angiopathy Blackwood type had reached its terminal stage. The progressive buildup of protein deposits in Eliza's brain blood vessels had caused multiple strokes, leaving the once vibrant child bedridden and unresponsive. Samuel Blackwood, who had initially resisted the doctor's intrusion into family matters, now sat silently on the porch, his weathered face revealing the internal struggle between tradition and the undeniable evidence of its consequences. "Doctor," he finally said as Harrison prepared to leave, "I need to understand exactly how our family ways are causing this suffering. Not in your medical terms, but in plain language that our people can grasp." This request marked a turning point. Harrison arranged a community gathering at the small Baptist church that served Pine Hollow neutral ground where medical information could be presented without directly challenging family authority. The evening meeting drew not just the Blackwoods but members of connected families from surrounding areas. Using simple hand-drawn diagrams, Harrison explained the basics of genetic inheritance, illustrating how certain conditions remained hidden for generations until cousins with the same recessive genes had children together, giving their offspring 2 copies of the defective gene. "Think of it like this," Harrison explained. "Each of us carries some damaged instructions in our makeup. When we marry someone from outside our family tree, their different set of instructions usually makes up for our damaged ones. But when cousins marry, they often carry the same damaged instructions from their shared grandparents. and their children have no healthy backup. The silence in the church was profound as community members processed this information. Then Rebecca Blackwood, Samuel's niece who had married her first cousin William, stood up. At 34, she had buried 3 children, each dying before age 5 with symptoms similar to Eliza's. "I've given 3 babies back to God," she said, her voice steady despite the grief evident in her eyes. "If what you're saying is true, doctor, then William and I caused their suffering by our marriage. That's a heavy thing to lay on people who followed the ways they were taught." Harrison recognized the delicate balance required. "The children's condition wasn't your fault, Rebecca. You and William couldn't have known what was hidden in your family's makeup, but now that we do know, future generations have choices that weren't available to you." The discussion continued for hours, with family members sharing stories of unexplained deaths, disabilities, and strange ailments that had long been attributed to bad luck, divine punishment, or environmental factors. A collective understanding began to emerge. The pattern of intermarriage that had kept land and traditions within the family had also concentrated genetic disorders with devastating effects. If you followed this tragic story to this point, leave a comment saying, "I can't believe this happened in America," to help us understand who is connecting with these hidden historical truths. For the younger generation, this knowledge presented immediate dilemmas. Courtships already in progress between cousins were questioned. Family expectations about suitable marriage partners suddenly conflicted with concerns about genetic risks. Daniel Blackwood, Samuel's 19-year-old grandson, who had been expected to marry his second cousin Sarah, approached Harrison privately after the meeting. "Sarah and I have been planning to marry next spring," he confided. "We've been sweet on each other since childhood. But her brother has the clubfoot, and my sister lost 2 babies that never drew right breath. Are we doomed to the same heartache if we marry?" Harrison couldn't offer the certainty Daniel sought. Medical science in 1959 couldn't identify specific carrier status for most genetic disorders, leaving risk assessment to probability and family history. "The closer the blood relationship, the higher the risk," Harrison explained. "First cousins share about 1/8 of their genetic material, significantly increasing the chance that both carry the same recessive genes." This scientific reality collided with deep-rooted social practices. For generations, cousin marriages in Pine Hollow had reinforced family bonds, preserved land ownership, and maintained cultural continuity. Potential partners from outside the community were scarce. Given the Hollow's geographic isolation and the limited social opportunities available to young people in rural Alabama, the economic dimension further complicated matters. The Blackwood family lands, divided among descendants through carefully arranged marriages, provided subsistence for the entire community. Marriage to outsiders could fragment this tenuous economic foundation, introducing land claims from unrelated families. Samuel Blackwood articulated this concern during a private conversation with Harrison. "Doctor, I understand your science. But these young people can't just drive to the city and find different spouses. This land is all we have, and our marriages have kept it intact for generations. Without that, what becomes of our community?" This tension between medical advice and socioeconomic reality characterized similar communities throughout rural Alabama. Harrison's expanding research had identified numerous genetic islands, isolated populations with distinctive patterns of hereditary disorders maintained by geographical isolation, poverty, limited education, and consanguineous marriages. In the coal mining community of Morgan Creek, Harrison documented a family with hereditary progressive nerve degeneration so prevalent that locals had named it miner's shakes, incorrectly attributing it to occupational exposure. In the farming settlement of Cedar Junction, he found a cluster of families with a distinctive form of congenital heart defect that had claimed dozens of children across 4 generations. These communities shared common elements: physical isolation that limited the pool of potential marriage partners, economic hardship that made preserving family land through intermarriage a survival strategy, limited access to education that restricted understanding of genetic risks, and strong cultural traditions that valued family continuity above potential medical concerns. Harrison's work increasingly addressed these social determinants, working with county extension agents and public health nurses. He developed educational programs that acknowledged the economic and cultural contexts of consanguinity while explaining its medical risks. The approach proved more effective than direct condemnation of family practices. By late 1959, Harrison noted encouraging changes in several communities, including Pine Hollow. Young people, when provided with both medical information and practical alternatives, increasingly sought partners from neighboring communities. Families began organizing social gatherings with other settlements, creating opportunities for young people to meet potential spouses beyond their immediate family circles. For older generations, however, the new understanding brought a different kind of pain recognition that their adherence to tradition had unintentionally contributed to family suffering. Samuel Blackwood, who had arranged numerous cousin marriages among his descendants, carried this burden heavily. "I did what my father taught me was right," he told Harrison during Eliza's final days. "Kept the family strong, kept the land together. Never imagined I was passing down sickness with the Blackwood name." Eliza died in August 1959, just shy of her 6th birthday. Her funeral at the Hollows Small Cemetery brought together the entire extended family, including branches that had moved away generations earlier. Harrison, invited to attend, observed the beginning of a community transformation, grief giving way to resolution, with even the most traditional family members acknowledging the need for change. In his research journal, Harrison noted, "The Blackwood family stands at a crossroads between tradition and scientific understanding. Their response to tragedy, opening their community rather than withdrawing further into isolation, offers hope that similar communities might find their way toward genetic diversity without abandoning their cultural identity." The price of isolation had been measured in children's lives and family suffering. But from that painful accounting came the possibility of a different future, one that honored family connections while recognizing the biological necessity of genetic diversity. By early 1960, Dr. Harrison's research had expanded significantly, encompassing 12 isolated communities across northern Alabama, with support from the University Medical Center and a modest grant from the Public Health Service. He had established a systematic approach to documenting the patterns and consequences of consanguinity in rural populations. Winter rains had made Pine Hollow nearly inaccessible, but Harrison maintained contact through weekly radio calls to the general store that served as the community's connection to the outside world. The news that reached him reflected both progress and ongoing challenges. Daniel Blackwood had postponed his marriage to cousin Sarah, instead finding work in Birmingham's steel mills. 2 other young couples had followed similar paths, seeking opportunities in urban areas where they might meet potential partners outside the family circle. Yet economic necessity had forced several families deeper into the hollow, reinforcing their isolation despite new awareness of its genetic risks. Harrison's expanded research revealed distinct patterns across different communities. In areas where mining or manufacturing provided employment options, young people increasingly broke the cycle of consanguinity by relocating for work and finding partners in more diverse settings. In purely agricultural communities, especially those with collectively held family lands, consanguineous marriages remained common despite educational outreach. The medical consequences of these patterns were starkly evident in Harrison's growing case files. Communities with higher rates of cousin marriages consistently showed higher prevalence of recessive genetic disorders, with some conditions appearing uniquely in specific family groups. The Blackwood family's distinctive neurological disorder, now documented in 16 cases across 4 generations, was just one example of what geneticists would later term founder effects in isolated populations. Harrison's collaboration with Dr. Eleanor Wright at the University Medical Center led to more sophisticated analysis of these inheritance patterns. By cross-referencing family histories with medical records and death certificates, they constructed detailed pedigrees showing the transmission of specific conditions through generations of intermarried families. "What we're seeing is classic Mendelian inheritance," Dr. Wright explained during a case review session. "These recessive conditions remain hidden for generations, with carriers showing no symptoms. Then consanguineous marriage brings together identical recessive genes from common ancestors, and the condition suddenly appears in children." The genetic disorders documented in Harrison's study communities represented a wide spectrum of conditions. In Pine Hollow, beyond the Blackwood neurological disorder, Harrison identified cases of polydactyly, extra fingers or toes, congenital heart defects, metabolic disorders resulting in developmental delays, and a distinctive form of progressive vision loss. In the mining community of Colville, he documented a high prevalence of Ellis-Van Creveld syndrome, characterized by short limbs, extra fingers, heart defects, and dental abnormalities. The condition, first documented among the Amish in Pennsylvania, had likely been introduced to the Alabama community by a single carrier in the founding population, then concentrated through generations of cousin marriages. In the farming settlement of Mayfield, Harrison found multiple cases of a rare blood disorder causing severe anemia, enlarged spleen, and vulnerability to infections. 3 families had lost children to this condition, which only manifested when a child inherited the defective gene from both parents. A scenario made significantly more likely by the community's high rate of first-cousin marriages. The human impact of these genetic patterns extended beyond medical symptoms to profound social and psychological effects. Affected families often face stigma, with local folklore attributing birth defects and developmental disabilities to moral failings or supernatural causes rather than genetic inheritance. Martha Jenkins, whose daughter was born with a severe form of osteogenesis imperfecta brittle bone disease resulting from consanguinity, described this stigma during an interview with Harrison. "The church ladies bring food and say they're praying for us. But I see how they look at her like she's punishment for something we did wrong. My husband's aunt openly says it's because we're cousins that God doesn't approve of our marriage. How do you bear that on top of watching your child suffer?" These social dimensions became increasingly central to Harrison's work. Working with local clergy, teachers, and community leaders, he developed educational materials that addressed not just the medical facts of genetic inheritance, but also the harmful myths and misconceptions surrounding birth defects and developmental disabilities. The scientific understanding of genetics was itself evolving rapidly during this period. The field of medical genetics was in its infancy, with new discoveries regularly reshaping understanding of inheritance patterns. Harrison kept pace with these developments through regular correspondence with leading researchers and attendance at medical conferences. In his case notes from March 1960, Harrison reflected on this evolving understanding. What we once dismissed as bad blood or divine punishment can now be understood as specific genetic mechanisms. The tragedy is that this knowledge remains largely confined to academic circles, while the communities most affected by genetic disorders lack access to even basic information that might guide their family planning decisions. This gap between scientific knowledge and community practice represented Harrison's greatest challenge. In Pine Hollow and similar communities, deeply held beliefs about family loyalty, land preservation, and appropriate marriage partners had evolved over generations in response to economic necessity and social isolation. Scientific information alone was insufficient to change these patterns. Effective intervention required addressing the underlying social and economic factors. Harrison's approach evolved accordingly. Rather than directly challenging cousin marriages, he focused on creating broader social connections between isolated communities, establishing regular inter-community gatherings that provided young people with opportunities to meet potential partners from similar cultural backgrounds but different. Genetic Lineages, the Community Connections Program, launched in spring 1960 with support from County Agricultural Extension Services, organized monthly social events rotating among participating communities. These gatherings combined educational presentations on health topics with social activities, designed to build relationships across community boundaries. Samuel Blackwood, whose initial skepticism had given way to cautious support, offered the Pine Hollow Schoolhouse as a venue for one such gathering in April 1960. The event drew families from 3 neighboring communities, creating what Harrison described as the first significant genetic outflow opportunity in 3 generations for the younger Blackwoods. Progress was measured in individual decisions rather than community-wide transformation. When 18-year-old Ruth Blackwood began courting James Mercer from neighboring Bell Creek following a community connections dance, it represented one small step toward genetic diversity. When Daniel Blackwood returned from Birmingham with a non-related fiancée, it signaled a more significant break with tradition. Yet economic realities continued to exert powerful counterpressure. The agricultural communities of northern Alabama offered limited employment opportunities beyond family farms, making relocation for marriage a privilege available primarily to young men who could find industrial work. Young women, constrained by both economic dependency and stricter social expectations, had fewer options for expanding their marriage prospects beyond family circles. Harrison's research increasingly highlighted these structural factors in a presentation to state public health officials in Montgomery. He argued that addressing rural genetic disorders required economic development as much as medical intervention. The pattern of consanguinity we observe in isolated rural communities is not simply a cultural preference, it's often an economic necessity created by limited mobility and restricted land ownership. Until these communities have viable economic alternatives to keeping property within family lines, cousin marriages will persist, despite their known genetic risks. This perspective represented a significant evolution in Harrison's approach. His initial focus on documenting medical consequences had broadened to include the complex interplay of economic, social, and cultural factors that maintained patterns of consanguinity, despite emerging awareness of its genetic risks. By mid-1960, Harrison's research had documented 143 cases of genetic disorders across 12 communities, representing 37 distinct conditions. This work constituted the most comprehensive study of consanguinity effects in the rural American South to date, challenging the medical establishment to recognize genetic disorders as a significant public health issue in rural populations. The patterns revealed by this research would eventually contribute to broader understanding of genetic inheritance and inform more culturally sensitive approaches to public health in isolated communities. For the families involved, however, the most immediate impact came from the gradual normalization of reaching beyond family circles for marriage, partners, a social change that promised healthier futures for coming generations, while preserving the close-knit community structures that had sustained them through decades of hardship. Autumn colors painted the hills surrounding Pine Hollow in brilliant hues as Dr. Harrison made what would be his final research visit in October 1962, after 5 years of systematic documentation. His groundbreaking study of consanguinity and genetic disorders in rural Alabama was drawing to a close. The changes he observed in the communities he had studied offered both encouragement and sobering perspective on the challenges of breaking deeply established patterns of intermarriage. Samuel Blackwood, now approaching 70, greeted Harrison at the family homestead with unexpected news. Daniel's wife had their baby last month, he announced with evident pride. A healthy boy with all his fingers and toes, strong lungs, and a good cry. They named him Thomas after you. This small personal victory, a healthy child born to a Blackwood, who had broken the pattern of consanguinity, symbolized the progress Harrison had documented across multiple communities. His research now encompassed 218 families in 17 rural settlements, with comprehensive medical and genealogical data spanning up to 7 generations. The resulting publication, Patterns of Consanguinity and Genetic Disorder in Rural Alabama Populations, would become a foundational text in the emerging field of community genetics. The transformation in Pine Hollow reflected broader changes Harrison had observed. Of 16 marriages involving Blackwood descendants since the study began, 9 had been to partners from outside the immediate family circle. The Community Connections program had expanded to include quarterly gatherings rotating among 7 participating communities, creating social networks that extended beyond traditional family boundaries. Yet challenges remained. Economic pressures continued to limit options, particularly for young women. While industrial development in Birmingham and other urban centers provided employment opportunities that allowed young men to relocate, rural women faced more restricted prospects. As a result, cousin marriages remained more common among female family members, perpetuating genetic risks in some branches of extended families. The medical consequences of past consanguinity also continued to manifest. During his final visit, Harrison examined 3 new cases of genetic disorders in Pine Hollow, alone children born to couples who had married before the study began. These included a 2-year-old with symptoms suggesting the early stages of the Blackwood neurological disorder, and an infant with a congenital heart defect requiring specialized care. Rebecca Blackwood, who had lost 3 children to genetic disorders before Harrison's study, now served as an informal community health educator. Drawing on her personal experience and the knowledge gained through Harrison's research, she counseled young couples about genetic risks and helped affected families access medical resources. "I tell them that marrying cousins is like planting the same crop in a field year after year," she explained to Harrison. "Eventually the soil can't support it anymore. Our family needs new blood, just like fields need rotation and fresh seed." This agricultural metaphor, more resonant in farming communities than abstract genetic explanations, had proven effective in shifting perspectives on traditional marriage patterns. Harrison had incorporated similar culturally appropriate messaging in the educational materials developed through the study. The broader impact of Harrison's research extended beyond the specific communities he had studied. His work had drawn attention to genetic disorders as a public health issue in rural populations, challenging the medical establishment to consider how geographical isolation, economic factors, and cultural practices contributed to patterns of disease. At the state level, this awareness had led to modest but significant policy changes. The Alabama Department of Public Health had incorporated basic genetic counseling into its rural health programs, training county nurses to identify potential hereditary conditions and provide appropriate referrals. The University Medical Center had established a specialized clinic for rural families affected by genetic disorders, with travel assistance for those from remote areas. Yet these institutional responses remained inadequate to the scale of the issue. as Harrison noted in his final research report. The medical consequences of consanguinity in isolated rural communities represent a significant but largely unaddressed public health challenge. Economic limitations, cultural factors, and inadequate healthcare infrastructure continue to perpetuate patterns that modern genetic understanding should have rendered obsolete. On his final evening in Pine Hollow, the community gathered at the Baptist church for a farewell dinner. Families Harrison had documented for years brought dishes reflecting the simple but hearty cuisine of rural Alabama: fried chicken, cornbread, green beans with fatback, and sweet potato pie. Children he had examined as infants, now running and playing among the pews, offered physical evidence of both the community's resilience and the ongoing expression of its genetic heritage. Samuel Blackwood, speaking for the community, presented Harrison with a hand-carved walking stick made from pine harvested in the hollow. "You came here as a stranger asking questions we didn't want to answer," the patriarch acknowledged. "You leave as a friend who helped us see what we couldn't see for ourselves, even though it was in our own blood." The gesture moved Harrison deeply. In his journal that night, he reflected, "The Blackwood family's willingness to examine their traditions in light of scientific understanding represents a profound form of courage. Our story is not one of ignorance overcome by education, but of a community finding ways to preserve its identity and values while adapting to new knowledge." About the biological consequences of isolation, this nuanced perspective had come to define Harrison's approach. His initial clinical detachment had given way to deep appreciation for the complex interplay of factors that had created and maintained patterns of consanguinity in rural communities. The genetic disorders he documented were not simply medical phenomena but manifestations of historical, economic, and cultural forces shaping family formation over generations. As Harrison prepared to leave Pine Hollow for the final time, Rebecca Blackwood shared a confidence that captured this complexity. "Doctor, I sometimes wonder if our ways were wrong all along or if they were right for their time and just outlived their purpose. My grandparents married cousins because it kept the family strong when everything else was uncertain. Maybe our job now is to find new ways to keep that strength without the suffering it came to cause." This insight echoed what Harrison had observed across multiple communities, a gradual, uneven transition from patterns of marriage that had evolved in response to geographical isolation and economic necessity toward greater genetic diversity. The process was neither complete nor uniform, with some families embracing change more readily than others and economic constraints continuing to limit options for many. The legacy of past consanguinity would continue to manifest in genetic disorders for generations to come, as recessive genes pass silently through family lines waiting for the chance combination that would express them in affected children. Yet Harrison's research had helped break the cycle of ignorance that had perpetuated these patterns, despite their visible consequences. In December 1962, Harrison presented his complete findings at the Southern Medical Association's annual conference in New Orleans. His documentation of 37 distinct genetic disorders, occurring at elevated rates in consanguineous rural communities, represented groundbreaking work in American medical genetics. More significantly, his analysis of the social, economic, and cultural factors maintaining patterns of consanguinity offered a framework for intervention that acknowledged the complex reality of rural life. The Blackwood family and other communities Harrison had studied became reference points in the developing field of community genetics, examples of how isolated populations developed distinctive genetic profiles through founder effects and subsequent inbreeding. The Blackwood-type neurological disorder would eventually be mapped to a specific genetic mutation, one of many conditions first documented through Harrison's rural Alabama research. For the families themselves, the study's most meaningful impact came through changed marriage patterns. By 1970, a follow-up assessment would document significant declines in consanguinity rates across all study communities, with corresponding decreases in the incidence of recessive genetic disorders. Educational outreach, economic changes, and improved transportation had combined to break the geographical and social isolation that had maintained genetic islands in rural Alabama. Samuel Blackwood did not live to see this full transformation. He passed away in 1966, having witnessed the birth of 5 great-grandchildren free from the genetic disorders that had affected previous generations. His family continued to inhabit Pine Hollow, but with increasing connections to surrounding communities in urban areas, gradually integrating into the broader genetic pool of the region. Dr. Thomas Harrison's study of consanguinity in rural, quote, Alabama communities stands as a landmark contribution to understanding how isolation, geographical, economic, and cultural shapes human genetic health beyond its scientific significance. It represents a compassionate engagement with communities navigating the challenging intersection of tradition and modern medical knowledge. The story of the Blackwood family and similar communities across rural Alabama reveals how deeply human genetic health is embedded in social context, how patterns of marriage and family formation that evolved in response to historical circumstances can carry unintended biological consequences across generations. It also demonstrates how communities can adapt their traditions when provided with knowledge and options that respect their fundamental values while addressing health concerns. As we've traveled through this dark chapter of rural American history, we've witnessed how isolation and tradition combine to create genetic tragedy, and how knowledge and connection offered a path forward. If you've followed this journey to its conclusion, please leave a comment saying I watched till the end, so I can connect with viewers who value these deep historical explorations. Don't forget to subscribe to see more hidden American histories that shaped our nation's genetic and social landscape. Like and share this video to help others discover these forgotten stories that still have much to teach us today.